Hi, everyone. This is Melissa Mari with my podcast. It's called Living Gold. And this is where we feature other humans like yourself to tell their story because that's the way the universe works. That's the way we all work is through story. And everyone has a sacred story. And I want to feature people that I know, and I know that their stories are pretty amazing, and just to show how it all connects and how it's all so important to the whole. So today I'm excited to bring you Leslie Powers. And she is the co-host of a podcast that they invited us on that's called Dissolving the Divide. And they have really amazing guests, and they discuss all sorts of topics, some through the One Great Work Network. And so that's how I met Leslie, and I was listening to her and some of the things that she was saying, and I knew that she had a story that was important. So that is why we're here. And Leslie, you want to give a little background, and we'll.
Sure. Yes. Well, hello, everybody. Melissa, thank you for having me on. It's a beautiful project. And I think part of what's beautiful about it is how it brings out a personal element to people rather than just focusing on the ideas. I think it's important that we integrate our lives into this material. And so I am living currently in Northern California, but I'm originally from upstate New York. I've bounced around the country a bit and landed here in this beautiful country of Northern California. I'm a clinical social worker. I'm licensed here in California, and I've been doing psychotherapy work for over a decade, but over 30 years in the field doing a lot of social work in different settings. So that's my professional piece. I am a mother of 3 kids, 24, 23, and 16. I have been a martial artist. I, am deeply connected and love, nature. That's always been sort of my saving grace throughout my life. And I have really, I think, stepped into an aspect of my life journey and my purpose here. I think I see myself now really wanting to do more education, as well as helping assist people through their healing work, but education around the personal psychology, the trauma and the effects of trauma, and how do we overcome and integrate ourselves, but also in the context of our larger world, so that we can fully understand this deep interconnection between the goings-on of the world and our own lives, and understanding natural law as opposed to kind of man's law, understanding the concepts of freedom and natural law. So it's my focus now.
Great. That's fantastic. So, what was your first memory that had a powerful impact on your life?
So I was thinking about first memory in general, and it's hard to just figure out. I lived in a house, one particular house that I remember very clearly from birth until about 4 years old. And I have a few memories that I consider significant, but I think the first is probably one of this vague memory of actually like being in a crib in the dark and standing at the edge and crying for somebody to come and get me, just not feeling trapped, feeling a bit abandoned there.
This was in upstate New York?
Yeah, I grew up in a little town called Vestal outside of New York. So it's kind of central New York, close to the Pennsylvania border. And I lived with my mom and dad and later had a sister, which, my early memories are actually kind of embarrassing. I remember this when my sister was born, not really being happy about that, and going to the neighbors to see if they had any interest in getting a little baby girl. My mom,
What's the age between you and your
three and
sister?
a half.
Yeah, that's about, that's about this. And you're the older one? Yeah, my
Yeah.
sister was in that kind of situation, and my mother wasn't present. Found out later a lot of mental illness. But so my sister got all this responsibility when I was born. Was that the case with you, that you had?
I don't know that it was responsibility as much as just feeling perhaps like I needed or wanted more attention or more understanding of my own needs. My mom and dad were just very busy working people.
Mm-hmm.
And my mom worked, my dad worked a lot, was gone a lot. And there was a certain spirit of kids were given freedom. I had a lot of freedom, but I didn't have a lot of direction and not a lot of direct nurturing in some ways. I'm sure that I had my basic nurturing needs.
You're a Gen Xer, right? Like
65. I was born in 60.
Yeah. So as I am, and what I found with a lot of Gen Xers is the positive side is that we had a lot of freedom. And so we had a lot of time that we could explore, and there wasn't a lot of people, around telling us what to do and bringing us from class to class, like what I've seen, in millennials or younger generations, where they're just totally, their whole lives are like on
Helicopter
schedule.
moms.
Yeah.
No. My mom grew up on a farm. There was, she told me later, which shed a lot of light onto kind of what I didn't really understand was happening. But she was raised with a very strong grandmother who had the philosophy as kids are to be seen and not heard. So she didn't get a lot, and she was an only child. And so I was, my mom was very solid and consistent, but she really sort of just let me do whatever. And my dad was working all the time. He worked a day job, and he was a musician who worked evenings and had gigs and taught people piano and was very, absent in some ways. And my dad to me I felt a bit more connected to him. I think we were a little more similar temperamentally. He was more affectionate. I loved when he would play music, and I would be drawn to him. And always throughout my whole growing up, that was my fondest memory, was following my father to the piano or the organ. And my mom was kind of stoic and, held things in. She wasn't super affectionate.
What kind of job did she do? What was her?
She was actually a social worker. She started out as a teacher, and then she worked in child protective services for a while, and then eventually became a nursing home social worker.
Wow.
She was very democratic, very, very community, oriented towards helping the underdogs, taking care of, people who needed. My father was more of the Republican, but he was also a very generous man, would take his organ, he would play music in the nursing homes for the residents and was very giving.
Did you grow up religious? Was there a background of that?
Both sides of my parents' families were strongly Protestant, and there's some real history I've recently discovered that goes back to that, the Protestant Reformation, and probably why my families moved to fled Europe, and some of them. But so we went to church, but I never. It wasn't every weekend. My dad played music late on Saturday nights,
Mm.
so it wasn't always we were up and out on Sunday mornings, but we did go to church, and it seemed to be important to them. For me, I never felt very connected to it.
Mm-hmm. I know that you were talking about nature. When did that become? Because that's like a sacred place for you?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. So by those first 4 years of living
Mm-hmm.
in this house, we had a big backyard and we had fruit trees, and there was a creek uh, behind our house. And this creek actually wound around, and there was a little bridge that the neighbors had built and they maintained. And I remember, I craved to go down to the creek. I craved to go and would beg my parents to take me. And they must have brought me at least once, but then they didn't really want to take me anymore. And I snuck away with an older kid and went down to the creek, and we had some kind of a argument, and I fell in the creek and I was all wet, and I got in trouble. I remember that whole thing. But I also really I remember when the neighborhood came to repair the bridge, and I found this experience really satisfying, of having like this community of people building this bridge together. And I was sitting down in the ground with my friend with a hammer, banging, the hammer into dirt and things, and feeling like this sense of connection. I think it's probably one of my first like real gelled memories of how community can come together and collaborate.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah.
And so that's been like an important little thread for you is building, having community that can really create together and work together.
Yeah. I think it planted a seed. In terms of the nature connection, it was that drawing to this creek, which I later, read about, and this was Native American land, Iroquois land, and this area where we lived were places that some of the Native Americans, I think when they were relocated at various points, were camping alongside this creek, and it connected in with the Susquehanna River. And there's two rivers, the Shenango and the Susquehanna. And the Susquehanna, I ended up moving to another house that was closer to that river. And my best friend and I would wander all the time out in nature. We would be up in the woods, and I would be by myself sometimes in the woods behind my house and exploring like magical doorways and just feeling like it was suspended in time. And we would sneak down and wander around the river and cross the railroad tracks and play in this cemetery, this big cemetery on these rolling hills, where we would have this imaginary life, basically.
Right.
This whole world we created, and we would be like leaping across building to rooftops and hiding, and things like that. It's very fun.
Yeah, if you look at that in the Jungian lens, the whole ideas about rivers and life and the journey, and it's a very, the visual of that is so archetypal.
Yeah. And learning more about my ancestry. Well, my mother grew up on land that ended up being generations of a homestead of a family that came from Holland. They're Dutch. And so they were very water oriented, and were, ship skippers and captains, but living on rivers. And so the Delaware River was really an important place where this house was, and this land that I would explore and, find snakes and different creatures and frogs. And so the rivers seem to play an important role for me, seem to be near them throughout my life.
Yeah, actually, we were about to go back to Europe for a few weeks. Collins band is having another festival in the Czech Republic, but most of his friends are all from the Netherlands. So we spend time, and it's an amazing country, and the people and the technical ability of how they've utilized, building all these, these areas that would go underwater, and it's amazing, but that also, it hasn't lost the nature, even with their technical making dams and making what do they call the whole network? Yeah, that nature herself they've worked with the water, with
the landscape. And,
So it's
beautiful.
they're amazing people. It's I think kind of people don't realize how great that country is. It's pretty amazing.
I didn't appreciate it really growing up. My mom seemed to have some disconnect from the history of her own family, and so a lot of what I've learned from the internet, actually, around some of my ancestors and the land and the significance of the story. But I felt it. I think as a child, especially.
Do you know where they came from? Which? I
think
part?
One of the towns that's standing out is Gemeron, Gemeron, Gemeron. It's near Amsterdam. But I think that there are still like relatives there. And that's an interesting story. In 1682 or something, I've been able to trace my lineage back to this man who had to fled the country after he was in a fight in a tavern and killed a man. And there's like a little bit of a story there, but we don't really know what it was about. Wow. And he was going to be killed if he didn't leave. There was like a statement that if he were to return, that he would be killed by sword. And they claimed his land, and then he and his wife and his 2-year-old baby went on a ship called the Painted Cow across, and then settled into what was then New Amsterdam.
Oh, in New York,
Wall Street, before the British changed it, took over again, and it wasn't long after they got there that I think it shifted to New York.
Wow, wow!
So we were there, way back. The lineage, like the youngest sons were twins that are my descendants, that were some of the first creators of the Staten Island Ferry. And then there was a Revolutionary War lieutenant who was part of like the frontier, holding the frontier line in New York. And so it's pretty interesting.
Wow. So, I think this is really important, our epigenetics. If anyone who is listening to this, I really do recommend looking into your family and your relatives and your ancestors, because they have an incredible effect on your life in ways that we are hard to like just consciously think about. But if you start to discover them and learn about them, you start to see the connections, the connections between your ancestors and the life that you're living. And it's very fascinating. And I'm glad you shared that, because I definitely recommend that as a way of internal discovery.
I agree. It's hitting home for me recently because I've been putting a lot of energy into this study recently. So it's on my mind. And I find it to be really empowering. There's two aspects to it. One is throughout most of my life, I felt very disconnected from it, with some tinge of like, there's something about it I don't really like, that isn't good. And I've had to ask myself, why is that? Why is it that my mom didn't have like a pride in this family lineage? Like she and my dad, they basically sold the whole homestead, everything, all the antiques and everything that to me as a child, and I felt was really sacred, was like sold, and so much information I didn't learn. And now I'm learning it, recognizing the good and the bad aspects of it. Right. But it's interesting now where I feel like I'm falling into a purpose of my own that seems connected to some of my lineage in terms of fighting for freedom. I have some ancestors that were Huguenots, like part of the Protestant Reformation, and also fled because to protect their lives, to be able to have the freedom to practice religion. So it's like, wow, it's kind of, is it coincidence that I am now in sort of a cutting edge of fighting for freedom? I don't think so. I think that this is like something in me that I've been able to access and awaken. And it's like I have a mission that goes beyond myself.
Yes. I totally agree with the way that you're looking at it. I felt that with my own background as far as dealing with trauma on my father, well, both sides. There was, on my mother's side, her mother was in an orphanage with her brothers and sisters, and had to deal with that, and that got passed over into me. And then on my father's side, they were Jews and my grandfather had to flee as a child to relatives in Massachusetts during the pogroms, in the late 1800s, early 1900s. And all that trauma and all the good and the bad does, I feel, get passed on into our DNA.
I agree.
Yeah. And so this is, again, why I find that it's important that even if your own life is going a certain kind of way and you don't quite understand it, or say all of a sudden something happened out of the blue that is like traumatic and you don't understand where it comes from. If you start to look at the family ancestry and the family trauma, you can start to understand in your own psyche how that could have an effect on your own trajectory, on your own life, your own healing. So it's very interesting. Again, I think it's you could spend a whole podcast on talking about this. And I think,
agree. Yeah, it's deep work.
And there's, people like Bruce Lipton who have been, from a biologist's point of view and how epigenetics works. So it's a whole new science and it's important. But I want to get back to your story. I know that you mentioned that you studied martial arts. How did that happen and why?
Yeah. So I was, throughout my young first decade of life, I was just very physically active, riding bikes, hiking, walking. And I think I did inherit some good athletic genes, right? And I felt this energy and this ability that wasn't really noticed much, in my first decade. But I had a best friend, and we discovered this opening of a martial arts school, a Taekwondo school, and we were really drawn to it together. And finally started classes, and I was 13 at the time. And it wasn't very long in that my instructor kind of pulled me aside and said, you have ability. You could be national champion.
Was your sensei from China, or where was he from?
Taekwondo is Korean.
Oh, Korean.
It's a Korean
I'm
martial
sorry.
art.
Yeah.
That really emphasizes kicking. And his particular ambition was very much in the sport aspect. And he ended up getting very connected in with the politics of Taekwondo. So that was very much a part of my experience. But for a while, it was just pure, punching and kicking. And it really was a catalyst for my personal confidence building and growth, because I had felt quite, I probably always felt a little bit on the outskirts, a little different, and not fully seen for my abilities and my intelligence or my physical ability. It really wasn't until, like when I started Taekwondo that somebody said, hey, you have ability. You could do something with that. And it wasn't until 9th grade that a teacher, noticed that I was smart and told my mom, I was smart as a whip, right? No one had ever kind of given me those reflections, which, even though I had a free, happy, kind of happy-go-lucky sort of life, I kind of didn't have a lot of shaping of who I was or what my potentials were. So it felt really good, but scary at the same time. And I was curious. I was like, oh, really? I could be national champion. Let me try. So I trained, and then I became a national champion. And, and I was on the team in 1986. I took a gold medal in the nationals, and then I was on the team, and we went to Guayaquil, Ecuador for Pan American Championships. I did very well there. And what was happening, so what Taekwondo did is it brought me a poise. It brought me confidence. You have to take tests in front of people and talk, and it was an opening up to people in a bigger way. And I ended up having a lot of friends who were older than me, and propelled me into experiences I probably was way too young to have, and travel a bit. And so that took me on a journey.
Yeah. Definitely. So is there Taekwondo in the Olympics?
So this was part of the story, was that it was a demonstration sport in the 1988 Olympic Games. And so right at the time that I started to get into it, I was expected to be on, the Olympic team, And my instructor had ambition. So he ended up leaving Binghamton, went to Colorado Springs, and he was actually, when in Binghamton, he was the national team coach. So we had the national team, men's team coming to our hometown and training. I got to train a little bit with some of the team. And then he became, politically involved as the president of the U.S. Taekwondo Union. And I had another instructor who was an athlete training me there. But I had this is what has been frustrating about me in some ways, is that I tend not to want the same things other people want. So I'm on the US team. Everybody on the team is dreaming of being on the Olympics, and that's their goal and that's their ambition. And I was like, I don't care if I'm in the Olympics. I didn't have that ambition. I was like, I'm kind of here, I want to see how good I can be at this. What's my potential? And so the first year I was surprised, that I did pretty good. And then I was like, well, let me see if it's a fluke. I'm going to go back in 87 and I'm going to train. And so I trained really hard, and I was really excited about going to the nationals and seeing how good I could be. And then And then sadly, I ended up getting overtrained. And about 2 weeks before the event, I was like declining. And my instructor pointed out to me, he says, I think you reached a peak and now you're going down.
Oh,
And
no.
I'm like, yeah, I feel it. I'm like exhausted and my legs are getting heavier. And so when I showed up the day of the nationals, I felt horrible. I felt like I was getting sick. I couldn't lift my legs that had felt like light as feathers and fast as bullets. They were like heavy. And it was like hard to lift my leg. And I was panicking. I was like, what? I didn't train this hard to show up here and not be able to move. And so it was like such a struggle to get through the competition and manage to get through it and through the elimination rounds. And I ended up getting into the finals, which was at the end of the day. And I was in front of everyone, in the stands and in front of my instructor who I felt like I couldn't let down, And so I just pushed with willpower. It was all willpower, that match. And I ended up winning.
Wow.
Which was crazy. And on the stand, the second place woman who we had fought before in the previous year, and her name is Dana He, and she asked me, she said, my God, you don't even seem tired. How did you do that? I said, I was exhausted. I was so exhausted, but I trained with Chung-Shik Choi. And if you want to get endurance, you go train with Chung-Shik Choi. And so that was this little exchange we had on the platform. And then I chose not to go to the team trials. This was right before this was in 87. And it was really heating up to get the team for the 88 Olympics. And I chose not to go, which was like a huge disappointment for a lot of people. And I got a lot of flack for that and a lot of pressure. So that was like this pivotal decision I made that most people probably thought I made a really bad decision, but I just couldn't commit to it. And I was also extremely burnt out, and I was in college. I was in my last semester of my bachelor's, and I was just feeling a lot of pressure. And so I chose to not do it. And Dana, he really wanted it. And she did go and train with Chung-Shik. And she ended up with an Olympic gold medal.
Wow.
Yeah.
Very interesting. So there was a couple things that stood out to me is that when you went into that competition, you were exhausted. Everything felt really heavy. Looking back on it, do you think that some of this was like your own psyche saying, I'm at this crossroads, I don't really want to be doing this anymore? Do you think there was something more going on than just the overtraining? Because Colin and I talk a lot about psychosomatic illness and how that affects, our life.
It's an interesting question. I can't say that there's an obvious answer. I felt like it was a very physiological thing, and I really wanted to shine.
Right.
And I was really sad and frustrated. And yet I had a very ambivalent relationship to the expectations that were on me. I was very mixed because I had the political favor. And I also was, when I was on the team in 86, I didn't really have a great experience there. I didn't feel really the camaraderie or welcomed. And there was someone saying, like, oh, you're so lucky you have this instructor and you have, an ability and, you're going to it's an easy path. And I didn't like that idea that I would be succeeding based on my connections. And I also felt like I was seen as in some way that I really wasn't, or the experience that I had, because I was kind of, again, like neglected. And my instructor didn't train me. He was in like another state. my
Interesting.
main instructor. I'd never had anyone in my corner coaching me that really was really teaching me strategy. Like I just felt like I was very alone, and even in this, and so it was an irony. So there was an ambivalence, and I was overwhelmed. So there had to be a level of,
Well,
I don't know, is this what I really want?
Yeah, that's what it seems like. It was one of those crossroads for you, and that you took a different path. You could have ended up going to the Olympics and then ending up maybe being a taekwondo instructor eventually, or something like that. It's like so interesting because you were in college, and was your major psychology, or was that what you were?
Yeah.
So
And I was going already into a social work program in the fall. And so I didn't have that ambition to make my career Taekwondo, and I didn't really seek the benefits of having the status of that. And when I look in hindsight, Dana was the perfect person for that because she really wanted that, and she capitalized on that. She became a stunt double
Oh,
in
wow.
martial arts schools in Hollywood.
Wow.
And she became a motivational speaker, and she had an amazing story, a comeback story of her own. And so that was the path that she really was meant to be. And that wasn't the path that I wanted to be on or was meant to be. And so I needed to make this break to be authentic to myself. But it set me again as separate from everybody else in a way.
Yeah, so this goes back much farther as far as a child feeling that separation and not feeling connected to your family. And so this is another thing that we notice a lot when we're talking to people, is that they think that each little negative experience in their life, or these crossroad moments, or these feelings, just have to do with what's going on in the present moment. But a lot of times it's stemming from a deeper sense, or a deeper trauma. It could be that they either forgot about, or they disassociated from. And by getting in touch with this, when you start to look at your own personal story, if you really start to investigate, you start to see some of these deeper patterns, So this is great because we see a particular pattern that was developed from when you were a child, and then maybe even before that with your epigenetics. So yeah, it's very interesting. So let's okay. So after that, so you're in college, and did you just stop with the taekwondo pretty much at that point?
Yes. So I chose not to go to the team trials. I really did a big disconnect and focused on work. I went to graduate school in a couple hours away in Albany, New York. And I also got involved in a relationship that ended up becoming a marriage, but it was a very tumultuous one. And I think that also sidetracked me, so I would say that the romantic relationships have been an area of difficulty and dramatic ups and downs. And so that was beginning. And so I went to, did a first year in graduate school. Then I had this, like, one of my older senior students who worked in the Taekwondo world had tried to kind of give me motivation to go back and train, like it wasn't too late. And I was feeling a bit lost. And so I was like, okay, maybe I'll go back and try to train and we'll see what happens. But then I was rejected. And I went back. I dropped out of school, went back.
Oh,
My
wow.
instructor was like, you don't really want this. I'm not going to train you if you don't really want this. You know, he knew what it was like to really want something. He had an injury that kept him from going. And so I was like, okay, I'm going to keep showing up every day. I'm going to show up twice a day. I'm going to show him that I want this. And, but I was getting ill. I was getting sick. And like with colds, and I just, it wasn't feeling good. And then finally he brought me into a meeting and he said, okay, I will make a deal with you. If you change your weight division, I will train you. And then Dana, he was coming and he was going to train her, and he didn't want me in the same weight division. And at the same time, I was thinking about maybe going to Colorado Springs and training at the Olympic Training Center. And I could have done that had I pushed it, but I was kind of had a guilt thing going on that was the instructor's wife kind of gave me a guilt trip about whatever you do, don't leave Chungshik and go to Korea or go to Colorado Springs. So I felt that I was given a deal that was not acceptable to me, and I was between two unacceptable options. So I just said, I don't want this. And so then I completely left, again, went back into graduate school, disconnected from Taekwondo altogether, didn't follow the Olympics at all. Got through graduate school, put my head in the sand until after the Olympics, and my boyfriend called me and said that Dana, he had gotten a gold medal. And I was just like flabbergasted. I was like, oh my God.
Wow. Yeah.
It was kind of a big like, huh. So I was like, well, you know, I'm on my path. This was a calling. So I just went forward into, my work basically, and ended up moving from the East Coast and focusing on my work, and then the relationship, and travel to Mexico. He was from Mexico City. So there was an interesting cultural experience there as well. Yeah.
Was he the father of any of your children?
No. My children's dad, I met in my 30s. So that was like the next. I've been married twice. So my first husband was a gentleman from Mexico City, and then broke up with him. And I think maybe 3 years later met my kid's dad. Yeah. Okay.
Was that on the East Coast that you met him?
So I met my first husband on the East Coast. He had come from Mexico City and sort of rags to riches a bit, not that he became like super wealthy or anything, but he came with nothing and worked his way up. And then we moved to Albuquerque, New Mexico, which I really fell in love with that area.
Yeah, I love that area. I lived in Santa Fe for a while. Yeah.
Yeah. So then after that, I ended up getting pulled back into the Taekwondo world as working at the United States Taekwondo Union. So I was aware that I had this unresolved stuff in the back. I knew that I had not processed my Taekwondo story. And I had put it in a box, and it was somewhere I wasn't paying attention to. And I knew, on some level that I had to face it. And then I was given an opportunity to do that by being invited to work for the U.S. Taekwondo Union. And so I left. It just was one of those perfect storms. Well, timing, my marriage ended, or I had been in another relationship for a couple of years, and that had ended. And then my job situation was in transition, and my house was potentially going to be sold. And so when this opportunity came, which I had been given invitations before, but this was when I knew it was the right timing for me. I left Albuquerque, went to Colorado Springs. I worked at the U.S. Taekwondo Union. I was involved with athletes and coaches, including some of the athletes that were on the team when I was in it, but now they were coaches, and I was working with them and developing programs and facing all of the Taekwondo stuff.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So you went back to that, and then you met your ex-husband there.
Yeah. That's where I met my kid's dad through his sister, who worked at the U.S. Taekwondo Union. And that was really I met him at a time when I was feeling like I was really wanting to have children. I wanted to be a mom. And so that was a big driver. And he had lost some children. He lost a couple children. And so there was this connection around the desire to have a family and have children.
Okay.
Right.
Yeah.
But in so many other ways, we were not compatible at all. And so I would say my biggest challenge is the blind spots that I've had around relationships, and then getting into relationships that aren't really good fits, and then staying too long. And that whole dynamic of confusion.
Did your parents stay together, or did they get divorced eventually, or?
They stayed together. Yeah. So they died, and very loyal. And so, different. And so I think my loyalty came from that. But then I just really had no real, orientation around like relationship. And there was a lot of myself that I just didn't understand, didn't see in terms of relationship. So aspects of my life, pretty solid, strong, consistent, but the relationship world and not paying attention to intuition, because I can look back at pretty much every relationship and I can see where I had an intuition or a common sense that said, don't do this, or this is going to be a roller coaster ride, or, you should get out of this now, and then ignoring those messages.
I had the same experience in some of mine, the more traumatizing relationships that I had. But then it's like you get an intuition. One of my relationships, I got a really bad feeling in my gut when I met him, and I went against that feeling. And that was a disaster. That was incredibly traumatic. So these things, for us, I think some of it has to do with our age group. Like your parents sounded like they weren't like hippies, right? They were a little bit older. Yeah. My parents were a little bit older too, but my mother, and where I grew up, was right in the middle of the whole thing in Marin County and Mill Valley, and hippies were everywhere. And then, things like the New Age and water beds and all these things were started. And my best friend was Alan Watts' granddaughter. And, so it's just, I was just around it. But I do think that the way that we grew up, it was different than our parents. And we could just say, this isn't working, and, split up with a relationship and then try to figure it out and then have another relationship, So there's positive parts of that, and then well, I wouldn't say it's a negative thing, but I do see that. I guess I'm looking at the lack of commitment from the younger generation because their parents just didn't stay committed. I didn't.
Yeah.
I didn't have children, which I've had to go through my mourning about that.
Mhm.
I
Mhm.
do recommend women who are younger that really think very closely about not having children because I do think that it's very biological and is like one of the most important things that a woman can do. And to be told that you'll be happy and just have a happy go lucky life if you don't have children is not the case. I
Yeah.
mean, there's a few women that are just made not to have children, and that's fine. But I would say
Mhm.
generally, most women are designed and in your heart to to
Mhm.
to give birth and have children.
Yeah.
So I don't know your own experience with that, but you've had three children, so
Yeah.
you
I
know.
had a really strong, that, what do they call it, with the clock ticking kind of feeling.
Mm-hmm.
It became obsessive almost. It was something that I felt I needed to have a child,
Mm-hmm.
one day, one child. But I had a fantasy, I had an unrealistic expectation of that I could do it all, have it all. And I
Mm,
think that this was part of the generation that was the message that was starting to come out is
right.
you can have a career and you can have a family and you can have
Oh,
it all.
yeah.
And well, I thought naively that I could balance all of this in this
Mm,
wonderful way. And the reality of that was not true.
right.
And especially because the man I chose to be the father, he had so much trauma
Mm,
that he hadn't healed.
mm,
And he wasn't able to, sadly, do the healing work needed to really be there in the best
mm,
way as a father or as a
mm-hmm,
partner. So I was again kind of in this role that I've
mm, mm,
created in my life of like carrying it all on my own shoulders. It felt like a lot of the time, and doing it all and wearing myself out and not doing
mm.
a great job at things that were most sacred to me.
Were you, so you were working when your children were young? Yeah.
Yeah. So I would, to have the 2.5, 3 months of maternity leave and back to work.
Mm,
And I did my best to, do what I thought of as attachment based parenting, of nursing my kids and
mm-hmm,
co-sleeping and really carrying my babies and,
mm-hmm,
and, and reading to them and all this, right? And I did my best. But at a certain point, I can see where it wasn't protective enough in a way, with the way that life unfolded. So
mm-hmm,
my kids didn't get enough of me. I didn't have enough of me to give them all they needed.
mm-hmm,
And I've really done a lot of reflection really in the last few years as my youngest is getting older
mm-hmm,
and seeing the effects on my own children of the dysfunction, honestly, of me and their dad, and how we really, with the best intentions, didn't give them what we really hoped to give them.
Oh, your ex-husband, he was he working like full time when your kids were young?
He was and he wasn't.
Mm-hmm.
So he wasn't consistent in his employment, and
Mm-hmm.
that led to more pressure on me. So I
Mm-hmm.
was really throughout the 8 to 10, how long were we together? It was almost 10 years. I was really, the pressure was on me financially to always be working. And I was the primary person. Well, he went through college. Was going through college. And so it was, I just felt I was stretched quite thin.
Yeah, sounds like it.
Yeah.
So where you were living in Colorado then?
We lived in Colorado when my first two were born in Colorado. And my son was 1 when we moved to California because his family was here. We moved to Sacramento, and he had family in Sacramento, and then up north, further north where I live now. So we moved out to California, and my sister came with us and her daughters. That was kind of cool. For a while, my sister joined us, and then we came up here to Redding. Yeah.
Well, that's a beautiful place to move to. I mean, Redding, the city itself, is kind of mixed, but the whole area, I'm sure that you were able to get a decent job there too, because they need a lot of help. Yeah.
Yeah. I've never had trouble getting jobs.
Yeah.
That's always flowed, really. I've been able to get jobs and move across country and get jobs. And that's always flowed well.
Yeah.
But, at the same time, I as a social worker, I was working for agencies and very connected in with government funding but not really, it's sort of like getting jobs because the job was there, the need was there, but not necessarily choosing my path within the field.
I see.
Or choosing my work or knowing what is really my individual gift. So just been in the last few years that I've left all agency work. I think I left the last part-time agency just last year. So now I'm working as an independent contractor, really doing more private practice work, but still, taking insurances and connecting with the system in ways that I feel are painful and wanting to continue to break away from that.
Right. So we've got kind of a wide view of your life, but this is where it gets interesting to me is, and what Colin talks about a lot is when were you red-pilled? Like, what happened that made you realize that the system was corrupt and what was that moment for you?
Right. So I think I became awakened in increments throughout my life from just my observations. So as a young child, I had some observations about the expectations and societal biases around the way that girls and boys were treated differently, for example, or things like around gender. And then I had, in my experience of going to church with my parents, I remember very clearly a time in church where I really disagreed with something. And I said, why does this guy get the straight connection to God? I think I can get my own straight connection to God. I don't need to see him as some authority of truth on this. So I disconnected from kind of the idea of ministers or religion and decided that I would cultivate my own spiritual connection. So that was pretty young. And then I pursued sort of this spiritual path and got involved in some of the Eastern paths and meditations and things. But in terms of, I would say, what I would call really red-pilled is the recognition that government and this whole sort of political world is a facade, and is something very false. I very young decided that I am not in anything. Like, I am not going to affiliate with being Christian, especially in the religion. I was like, I will not attach to a religion. There is no one religion that has the monopoly on truth. There's got to be truth among all religious paths. And that's what I want. That's what I want to know. So I was young. That was sort of a path that I had to discover. And politically, I was sort of left leaning, I think. And that social work mentality is very integrated into kind of the left sort of make sure you take care of the underdog, help the poor and so forth. But I would still be like, I don't want to call myself a Democrat. Maybe I'll be an independent. I just had trouble with labels, but I did not see the illegitimacy fully of this system that we're immersed with. Little things happened like, 9/11, where I didn't immediately doubt it, but I questioned it. It didn't make sense to me how the whole building collapsed, so I just always had a curiosity and like, I'm not fully going to buy this hook, line, and sinker.
Yeah, I was watching it at the time. I was living in Santa Fe, and it was right before I was working I worked for Whole Foods for a long, long time, and I was working for them. And I was kind of like getting up and saw the second building. And I didn't immediately, the whole thing didn't make sense to me. That I knew that something was really not right with the story. And then a couple years later, Colin actually officially red-pilled me with a lot of the information, but
it was years. It was years later when I really recognized the significance of it, or really, came to the understanding that there was something fishy and about it, and that was so after 2009, really, because there were these seeds of things that I questioned earlier. But then in 2009, that was when I split from my husband, and I, really kind of held firm that, he needed to have time with his kids. And so when he had the kids, I was doing a lot of internal exploration. And then I felt like I had this just overwhelming input of new data and from that put into question everything the way I had lived and all that I had been exposed to. So this sort of Northern California, it's kind of mystical, getting up into Mount Shasta, up into Ashland, Oregon, just was hungry. I was very hungry for metaphysical understandings and more spiritual expansion. And it was through that time that that 9/11 became very clear, that I just became open. I've never been a real big conspiracy kind of junkie, but it was just like this overall tapestry of doubts and starting to see that the world isn't as it's been put out to be, right? It's not as I thought it was. When in 2018 is when I met someone who introduced me to Mark Passio, Seth Esposa, and this guy Thunder Wizard, Michael Denny. And that was the most pivotal period, especially Mark Passio's work, because that's when I really understood that there are, people who are deliberately causing harm in the world, very deliberate agendas of wrongdoings, and that I started to understand the connection to morality and natural law and the government, and everything just clicked together for me. And so since then, it's just been deeper and deeper.
Yeah, I was wondering when you start to get involved with the One Great Work Network and all that, and that was around that time, 2018.
Well, 2018, I was just doing massive learning. So listening to podcasts in every free moment as I was working and trying to raise my kids and everything. I would be always listening to the podcast. And then I felt the call, of action, that Mark Passio really gives us, like, I'm not just here to talk, I'm here to, to get more teachers. And I would take notes of things on my phone. And I was like, I want to do something. I don't know what. I thought of maybe setting up a movie night in the community, or I didn't really know what. But then I saw a call to action it was actually like a support group. Chris Jansen had put out an invitation to people in California who wanted to do kind of a supported meeting place for people who understood natural law and wanted to figure out what they wanted to do with it. And so that was the true catalyst to my action, because I was inspired by these people that I was connecting with to do something. And it was like Will Keller and John Rowland were already doing their podcast, and Chris was starting his End Evil, and Dom Tremblay in Canada, who's kind of faded out a bit, but he was really involved, even though he wasn't local. And, there was women down in Southern Cal, and there was just a few of us getting together. And so I took all these notes I had and I just organized them into a huge slideshow of like 350 slides. It was like crazy, and broke it up into parts, and then sat on it for a long time. And then finally kind of created some videos, and
Yeah, so that kind of moves into I'm really interested in the work that you started to do on trauma. And this came about, is this part of this presentation that you were working on at the time?
I wove it in. So it was in the end of 2020. And so it was like between the end of 2020 and 2021 that I put this together, and then bit by bit started to record. I still haven't actually recorded the whole thing. There's like eight different segments out there that are really deeply packed full. So my effort was to take the understanding that I gained of natural law and the implications of that in our social structure, in our government systems, and in all of these, like arms of the government that have woven their way into our lives and are holding us back from our full potential as humans, and from our ability to be truly free, and that we have gained an acceptance of this as if it's the only way to be, where we are sleepwalking, in a sense, disconnected from our true ability, what true freedom is, and what our true ability as humans is to create in the world. And then through that process, as I was doing in my work, as a psychotherapist, expanding and deepening my understanding of how trauma affects people, and then seeing how it is really a global traumatization that is keeping us stuck into this subtle but clear and obvious level of enslavement as a species, because of these power structures that are creating like a glass ceiling. There was in my Alive and Thriving presentations, I talked about the fish in the fishbowl, and then Chris Jansen and I did a talk about it where we use like Finding Nemo a little bit as an allegory of the scene where they're in the fish tank, where he was a free fish. He knew what freedom is, and then he got caught into this fish tank. And all the other fish were just like happy floating around in their fish tank, except for the one guy with the scar, the little fish, because he knew what freedom was too. And they were able to kind of motivate and inspire the fish in the tank to seek freedom, because they were able to tell him, like, there's something out there you don't know. And they were able to get their way out of the fish tank. But that glass ceiling, I think, is what we're living in. And we've become sort of we have this learned helplessness around it, where people generally feel like that there's nothing I can do about it. This is the way it is. And there's a big fear, so much fear. If you really keep peeling back and you analyze yourself in relationship to all the systems in your life, you start to see how you're there because of a sense of fear, anxiety. If I don't do this, what will happen? I'll lose my security. I'll, get in trouble.
Yeah, I don't know if you're getting this in your practice, but I know Colin is doing more coaching and consulting, consulting, counseling. I don't really it. Could be coaching in a certain sense, but it does seem like a lot of people are at this crossroads right now, of understanding that the system that we've created or we've been part of creating is not our friend, and that we do need to develop personal moral systems, and then expand that into our community. But a lot of what is really keeping us from this is the personal work, the inner work. That's why we end up, projecting the enemy out there. And we even do it within these great groups.
I know.
And I know that you're working on that through your podcast, with Derek, dissolving the divide is,
Yeah.
but I think, Colin has it worked out in the integral system. He has these 4 different quadrants, and they're dealing with, one is cultural, one is body, or the individual. He explains it really well, and it's in his new book, Transforming Darkness. But I do think that you're part of a cutting edge of people who are starting to really understand the problem. And I believe, I just saw this talk that Mark Passio did last night, and I haven't really watched that. I've watched his earlier lectures a while ago, when he was first getting into it, and he had a whole bunch of lectures on all different subjects. And I've watched some of those, but I haven't seen him recently. And apparently his biological father just died, and I'm sure it was very traumatic for him. And but he, in this talk last night, was really basically showing his anger and disgust at the movement that he helped create, right? And I feel like he's still going through, this is just my own interpretation. I don't know him or whatever, but it seems like he's still going through grief. The whole grief when someone close to you dies, or even in his case, his relationship with his biological father apparently wasn't, perfect or whatever. But it's hard to lose anyone that's important in your life, and the grieving period takes a while. And it seems like it was a combination of grieving and his frustration with people in the movement who are not really, quote unquote, doing the work, right? this is what, and it's interesting because Colin is talking about this a lot, about how we're not fully taking responsibility for this deeper work that we need to do, this, deeper shadow work,
Yeah.
really doing the kind of work that you've been doing on yourself. You have a really good sense of being able to step back from your life, start to be able to take apart all these different sections, seeing the parts where you had to learn different things about relationship and your relationship to relationship, and how all these different inner processes, right? That are really challenging to do. It's challenging work to start to take apart your own life story.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. It is foreign. It's foreign to most people. And I think most people have the attitude, it's the past, don't bother with it, it's over. And there's almost like a loyalty that I've been thinking about to our families, where it's, some people will be like, it's not okay to point out their wrongs, their failings, because that's being disloyal in some way, or there's so many defenses
Right.
around this, and we're also not taught it. And I
Yeah.
think it has a lot to do with how children, obviously, how children are raised, where children aren't being raised to be emotionally aware, and to learn how to self-soothe and to be, emotionally intelligent. So we're behind as a
Yes.
species in emotional intelligence, having to catch up to that. And the knowledge is not that appealing, right? My podcast, my little Alive and Thriving is densely packed information. And I know that it's kind of probably boring for a lot of people, or it's overwhelming very quickly. It probably needs to be broken down into bite-sized pieces, and being given people time and support, and really the reason why. Why is it important? And there's a disconnect. And I think one of the things that we can do to help people to be willing to do the work is to really connect the why it's so important, because the inner work is directly related to our outer experience in the world and what's happening overall among people as a whole, collectively, in the world. And if we don't like what's happening, to change it, it ultimately comes back to understanding our relationship to ourself and to our ancestry and to this history, our history individually, our history of our families, and our history collectively. To see where we are today and where we are shut down, been traumatized, we're frozen, we're disconnected, we're fragmented at all levels, within ourself and outside of ourself. And so to me, this work is so, so vital. And I want to get it across, and to be able to guide people who are motivated and see the value of it through this process. It's also what I see, it's about relationships. So a relationship with ourself and all of our fragmented parts of self that are not integrated, that are not communicating, that are reactive, when we can build a full picture of ourself and the relationship with ourself from a basis of love and self-defense. Those two pillars of non-aggression and self-defense are important within us. And my relationship experience taught me a lot about the inner self-defense that I didn't have in place.
Yeah,
Right, a
that's
lot of caregivers, rescuer types,
boundaries. That's as far as being a woman. What is our place in natural law, in the natural way that we're made, and then all this cultural crap, basically, that has been given to us, and some of it has been positive to kind of like, it seems like in order for something new and something more healthy to evolve, you have to break down. Things have to be broken down. So we've gone through that period, and now it's like there's a new movement of women and people that are starting to find the center of what it is to be feminine, what it is to be a woman, to be a partner, right?
Yeah.
And it's something that is, I feel like it's developing person by person, woman by woman. I don't think that you have to go to the other extreme. I don't think anything has to go to the other extreme. There's a new balance point, you know. But
I
so,
think, go ahead and finish.
oh no, go ahead.
I was thinking about the balance point within the natural law community, or in the freedom community, the truth community, however we want to call it, that there is, as far as teachers and our roles within it. And, you know, you brought up Mark Passio, and I want to share how I approach that intensity, because, and how I really try to navigate the controversy around some of the that intensity that he brings and that some others bring, and seems to stir up a lot of inner division, right, among people not liking what he says or how he says it or whatever. And so my approach, one, to all teachers is, I know that I'm not going to fully like everybody. I'm not going to agree with everybody. I know that every human is fallible. Every human is imperfect. So I'm not going to go in looking for a guru or someone who's going to have it all right or is going to be pristine in all their actions. I'm going to go in looking for the gem of truth, the gem of wisdom that I can integrate into my own journey and my own path to help expand my my wisdom base, my base of knowledge. And when I started to listen to Mark, you know, he has a very hard edge. He vents, he rants, he's aggressive, and it sounds, you know, very forceful in his language, and it turns off a lot of people. And he's only become like, he's turned the dial up on this. So for people who don't know his work, and I do not step into his current podcasts, you know, it's not a good idea, but to go back and really take this approach, look to this amazing expansive knowledge that he's sharing, and then notice how his personality triggers you.
Exactly. Right.
Notice what comes up with what he says and does. When he says, get as offended as you like, he means it. Because it's in our offense that we are forced to look at ourselves.
Right. Project.
And so I was looking at him, and like Seth Esposa too, they have this very like, and I was like noticing, you know, what it did to me. And it brought me into this contemplation about masculine energy, feminine energy, you know, what, and under what circumstances or conditions is it okay? Is it necessary to turn up that volume? And what is the role of the masculine in this fight for freedom? And what is my role? Where am I? How do I authentically show up? So I know that I'm not that. My style of teaching is very different. That doesn't make his style wrong. So I approach him with compassion. I always ask, okay, who is he talking to? what is his own personal experience that may have triggered this in him. I tend to be pretty good at seeing people's psychological, like the stuff that isn't spoken. So I have a deeper sort of understanding, and I sort of have compassion around that. I always look for that thread of compassion for the human. I look for the message, and I decide where I am at in relationship to that. If it becomes unhealthy for me, then I set a boundary. I don't have to stick around and listen. Or I can decide that the value of the material is worth it. So then I create my fields and my filters against that which I don't want to bring in. So that's how I approach it. And I think that we're in a place where we really need to be working together. It's going to take all types of people, all types of styles. It's going to take the soft, compassionate, feminine. It's going to be receptive, sort of forgive, it's going to take all of it. Because to make shift in the world, there's a place for all of it.
Yeah, we talk about,
other than actually doing harm, right? So that is the bottom line in natural law, is that you don't, cause harm to people through your actions.
Right.
And if we're not causing that harm, we get to have a loud voice if we want or not. And
yeah, I was just thinking about when you were talking about that, about the archetypes. Colin and I talk about that a lot, and how we all are carrying, some stronger, the warrior, the king, the magician, the lover. And some of us are carrying certain of the archetypes stronger just naturally in our psyches. And then some of us are carrying some of the other archetypes. I know I personally had a really strong warrior that just developed naturally in me, which is also my animus, in Jungian psychology, as a way of surviving my life and a whole bunch of trauma. You developed an incredible amount of confidence and conscientiousness and warriorship through your relationship to Taekwondo and going through all of that. You had to develop the warrior in order to win. And
I even think the relationships of my life, the dysfunction of them, really honed that warrior, the sword, because I was in these relationships where I was tolerating a lack of. I was tolerating more than I should have. I wasn't holding my line. Wasn't really loving and protecting myself in a way. So I was very much about overly compassionate, overly forgiving, giving benefit of the doubt, seeing potential but ignoring patterns of reality, things that are very not healthy, magical thinking. I had to get sobered up where that was torn away from me, to be able to look at the reality of, look, Leslie, you keep repeating these patterns, and you're not a victim. You are participating in these patterns, and you obviously need to learn to set some new types of boundaries and create some shields and access a part of that warrior in me that I think was worn out, and tired, and maybe lost somewhere or punished. I don't know what. This, I think, goes even before into my DNA, but I had to be awakened really to my own power, to my own confidence. This is, for me to be on a podcast, for me to be doing videos, are things that I wouldn't have imagined that I could have ever done. I was hiding out in my life. I was playing small, invisible. Don't make waves. Don't be seen too much. I also had like some bullying I didn't share about, that very much made some social exposure not feel safe. So it's pretty transformative. And I think it's unfortunately, like, I don't regret when I look back. I could from one lens say, oh my God, I wish I had knew this then. I would have saved myself a lot of pain and suffering. But at the same time, I can look back and say, okay, I had, on some level, I must have needed that level of wear down and suffering in order to get motivated enough to transform.
I think power. This is again, we're getting to about the hour and a half, which is where I like to wrap it up. But this is where the story becomes so important, because everything that's occurred to us throughout our story, the good, the bad, the ugly, the suffering, the suffering is what most of us are try to avoid. But every human being, in one way or another, is going to experience suffering. And so I think it's really honorable to be able to look at your story as you have been and get the grander picture and understand that this is how you're evolving. This is how you're learning. This is how you're becoming a better teacher, a better human being. And so I just give you a lot of credit for that. It's very beautiful. But I just, what if there's anything that you'd like to say or wrap up about this, about your life or what you've learned? And then you can...
Yeah, I think the symbol for my Alive and Thriving website is sort of a combination of a phoenix and a Valkyrie, right? And it's this, and I'm my Western sun sign is Scorpio. I've always connected with that sort of phoenix energy of transformation. And I think that it is through, the hardships and the fire and the disintegration that we then have an opportunity to be reborn into something lighter and brighter and more powerful. And we all have this opportunity. And the answer is to go within and face these shadows and these challenges, the hard work of which also is deeply rewarding, and it's self-loving. It really is. It brings you to a place of really valuing your unique self, and that we carry, this template of individuality that has been so mysteriously and amazingly created. And there's an excitement in sort of finding out who you are and what your opportunity is here. And I think that we're all born in this time and place for a reason. Like, our template is here to do something good, and finding out how to do that and freeing up our life so that we're not constantly living in a stress response and in kind of these confines of trauma and, stimulus response and, protection and ducking and all this life. The more that we can work together and detach from those systems that are sucking our life force, work together with people who are understanding this potential and understand the morality of life, we can offer each other a platform on which to sort of rise up and grow. So that's really my mission right now, is to continue my own journey, to teach and to inspire and partner with people to create, in a sense, a platform that our future generations can stand on for a better life, a better world.
That's excellent. I really appreciate you telling your story today, and for others to be able to hear it. And I want to, for those of you who are watching, please share or subscribe to Shadowtech Alchemy. This is where we have interviews and of all sorts. Also, some of you may know my own challenges this last year. I don't want to identify with the illness, quote unquote. We don't even know what cancer is, so I'm not even going to go there. But I still am not able to work. I'm hopefully going to be able to go back to work soon. But if you have any kind of donations that you have some, you could help me out. I really don't like to ask for help in this way, but lately I've had to, and some of you have just donated to me, and I cannot thank you enough. So if anybody through PayPal, you can, and we'll have everything in the show notes, and we'll have Leslie's email and her websites. And please get involved and start to look at your own life story and see how important your own journey is and where you're at. And we'll see you again in a couple weeks or next week. All right. Thank you
so much, Melissa. Thank you for everyone for watching. Yeah. Let's support each other on this journey. It's hard work.
Yes, definitely. Thank you. Okay.